What if the price of everything doubled, but nobody told you it was happening? Not next year, not over a decade, right now, this week, while you sleep, while you scroll, while you work a job that promised you security but delivered you a treadmill with no off switch. You'd notice, right? You'd feel it in your gut, in your wallet, in the way your grocery bill makes you wince every Sunday. But here's the thing, you already are noticing. You're already feeling it. And the people who designed this system are counting on you to blame yourself instead of them. This is the story of how your money learned to die. Slowly, quietly, with mathematical precision. And it's happened before. The year is 1973. A man named Richard stands in line at a gas station in Ohio. He's been waiting for 45 minutes. The engine of his Ford is off because he can't afford to waste fuel. The line stretches around the block, a snake of chrome and frustration baking under the Midwest sun. When he finally reaches the pump, the attendant tells him there's a limit. 10 gallons. That's it. Richard does the math in his head. 10 gallons used to cost him $3. Today it costs him $5.20. He doesn't say anything. What is there to say? He pays. He drives home. He sits at his kitchen table and stares at the bills spread out like a poker hand he's already lost. His paycheck is the same as it was last year, but the world around him costs more. A lot more. His wife asks him what's wrong. He doesn't know how to explain it. He just knows something broke, and it's not coming back. That something was the illusion of stability. See, Richard didn't know it yet, but he was living through one of the most violent economic experiments in modern history. The 1970s weren't just a decade of bad fashion and disco. They were a laboratory, a stress test, a controlled burn of the middle class to see how much heat the system could take before people started asking the wrong questions. And the fuel for that fire? Inflation. Not the 2% kind they teach you to expect, the double-digit kind, the kind that turns $1 into 90 cents, then 80 cents, then 70 cents, all while the man on the television tells you the economy is recovering. But to understand why the 70s happened, you have to go back further, much further, because the script for that decade was written in the 1930s, edited in the 1940s, and performed for the first time in the 1950s. The stage was set long before Richard ever stood in that gas line. Let's rewind. The year is 1933. America is on its knees. The Great Depression has turned the country into a graveyard of failed banks and broken men. 1 in 4 workers has no job. Families are living in shanty towns made of scrap metal and cardboard. Children are going to bed hungry in the richest country on earth. And at the center of this collapse is a single, inescapable fact. The money stopped moving. People hoarded cash because they didn't trust the banks. Banks hoarded cash because they didn't trust the people. And the economy, that great machine that requires constant circulation to function, ground to a halt like an engine with no oil. Enter Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a man in a wheelchair who somehow convinced a nation to walk again. His solution was radical for its time. The government would step in, not as a referee, as a player. The state would spend money it didn't have to put people back to work. It would build dams, roads, bridges, parks. It would hire artists to paint murals and writers to document history. It would flood the system with dollars and hope that the sheer volume of cash would restart the heart of commerce. And it worked, sort of. The economy stabilized. People found jobs. The bleeding stopped. But here's the catch. Once you open that door, once you let the government become the engine of the economy instead of just the mechanic, you can never fully close it again. Because the next time something breaks, people will expect you to fix it the same way, with money. Lots of it. Money that has to come from somewhere. Fast forward to 1944. The war is still raging. but the Allies can see the finish line. So they gather in a small town in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods. Economists, diplomats, and bankers from 44 nations sit in a hotel and redesign the world's financial system from scratch. Their goal is simple: prevent another Great Depression. Their method is elegant. They peg every major currency to the U.S. dollar, and they peg the U.S. dollar to gold. $35 per ounce. Fixed. Permanent. A golden anchor to keep the whole system from drifting into chaos. It's a brilliant plan, as long as everyone plays by the rules. As long as the United States doesn't print more dollars than it has gold to back them up. As long as trust holds. But trust is a funny thing. It's invisible until it's gone. And by the late 1960s, the cracks were starting to show. America was fighting two wars, one in Vietnam, one at home. The Vietnam War was a black hole of spending. Billions of dollars poured into a jungle on the other side of the world to fight an enemy that melted into the trees every time you thought you had them cornered. At the same time, President Lyndon Johnson launched the Great Society, a sweeping expansion of social programs, Medicare, Medicaid, the war on poverty, noble goals, expensive goals. And here's the problem. Johnson wanted to fund both wars at the same time, without raising taxes, because raising taxes is political suicide. So he did what governments always do when they want something they can't afford. He printed money. Not literally. The printing presses didn't run overtime. But the Federal Reserve expanded the money supply. They created dollars out of thin air and loaned them to the government. And all those new dollars had to go somewhere. They went into the economy. And the economy started to overheat. Imagine a bathtub. The water level represents the money supply. For decades, the faucet has been dripping at a steady rate, just enough to replace what evaporates. But now, someone cranks the faucet wide open. The tub starts to fill, fast. At first, it feels good. There's more water, more liquidity, more cash sloshing around. Businesses expand. Wages go up. People feel wealthier. But the tub has a fixed size, and once the water reaches the rim, it doesn't stop. It spills over. It floods the floor. And that flood is inflation. By 1971, the world was starting to notice. Foreign governments looked at the U.S. money supply and did the math. They realized America had printed way more dollars than it had gold to back them up, so they started asking for their gold back. France was the loudest. President Charles de Gaulle sent ships to New York Harbor to physically collect French gold from the Federal Reserve vaults. He was calling America's bluff. And on August 15th, 1971, President Richard Nixon blinked. He went on television and announced that the United States would no longer convert dollars to gold. The Bretton Woods system was dead. The anchor was cut. And the dollar, along with every other currency on earth, became what's called fiat money. Money backed by nothing except the government's promise that it has value. Think about that for a second. Your money, the thing you trade your life for, the hours and sweat and stress you pour into earning it, is only worth something because a group of people in a building said so. There's no gold in a vault with your name on it, no hard asset backing up the numbers in your bank account. Just trust, just faith, just the collective agreement that this piece of paper or this digital entry on a screen can be exchanged for food, shelter, and security. And the moment that trust wavers, the whole thing collapses. The 1970s were what happened when that trust started to wobble. Inflation didn't arrive all at once. It crept in. 1972, 4%. Annoying, but manageable. 1973, 8%. Painful, noticeable. By 1974, It hit 12%. Wages couldn't keep up. A dollar earned in 1970 was worth 65 cents by 1974. If you had savings, they were melting like ice cream on hot asphalt. If you had debt, you were drowning. And if you were retired, living on a fixed income, you were watching your life evaporate in real time. But here's the twist. The government's official response was baffling. President Gerald Ford launched a campaign called Whip Inflation Now. The slogan was Win. They printed buttons. They held rallies. They asked Americans to voluntarily fight inflation by spending less, saving more, and planting vegetable gardens. It was the economic equivalent of telling someone their house is on fire and handing them a squirt gun. It didn't work. Of course it didn't work, because inflation wasn't a personal failure. It wasn't caused by people buying too much or saving too little. It was caused by the money supply expanding faster than the supply of goods and services. And you can't fix that with a catchy slogan. The real villain wasn't some abstract economic force. It was a choice, a deliberate policy decision made by people with names and faces. The Federal Reserve, led by Chairman Arthur Burns, kept interest rates too low for too long. Why? Because raising interest rates would slow down the economy. It would cause unemployment. It would hurt businesses. It would make politicians angry. And Arthur Burns, for all his intelligence, was a political creature. He didn't want to be the bad guy. So he let inflation run. He hoped it would fix itself. He hoped some external shock would cool things down without him having to make the hard choice. Instead, the external shock made everything worse. In October of 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel, the Yom Kippur War. It lasted less than 3 weeks, but the aftershocks lasted years. Arab members of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, decided to punish the West for supporting Israel. They cut oil production, they imposed an embargo, and the price of oil quadrupled overnight, 4 times more expensive. In a world that ran on oil, cars, trucks, factories, power plants, heating systems, all of it suddenly cost 4 times as much to operate, and that cost got passed on to everyone. This is when Richard stood in that gas line. This is when the word stagflation entered the American vocabulary. Stagnation plus inflation. An economy that wasn't growing but where prices kept rising anyway. It wasn't supposed to be possible. Every economic textbook said you either had growth with inflation or recession with deflation. You couldn't have both. But there it was. Unemployment rising, GDP shrinking, and prices going up, up, up. The rules had changed. Or maybe the rules were never real to begin with. By 1979, inflation hit 14%. 14. If you bought a car, a house, a loaf of bread, it cost 14% more than it did the year before. Your paycheck, if you were lucky, went up 5%. You were losing 9% of your purchasing power every single year. And this wasn't some temporary blip. It had been going on for nearly a decade. An entire generation was coming of age in an economy that punished savers and rewarded debtors. An economy where the only rational strategy was to spend everything immediately because holding cash was the same as lighting it on fire. Then came Paul Volcker, a 6'7" giant who smoked cheap cigars and didn't care who he pissed off. In August of 1979, President Jimmy Carter appointed him chairman of the Federal Reserve. And Volcker did what Arthur Burns refused to do. He raised interest rates. Not a little, a lot. By 1981, the federal funds rate hit 20%. 20. If you wanted to borrow money to buy a house, your mortgage rate was 15, 16, 18%. If you wanted to start a business, good luck. If you wanted to buy a car on credit, you couldn't afford it. The economy seized up. Unemployment spiked to over 10%. Factories closed. Construction stopped. Farmers went bankrupt because they couldn't afford the interest on their loans. People hated Volcker. They mailed him wooden planks torn from unsold houses. They sent him angry letters. They burned him in effigy. But he didn't flinch, because he understood something fundamental. Inflation is a cancer. And you don't cure cancer with aspirin. You cut it out, even if the surgery almost kills the patient. By 1983, inflation was back down to 3%. The fever broke. The economy started growing again. And Paul Volcker became a legend. Not because he was popular, but because he was right. He proved that inflation isn't some mysterious force of nature. It's a policy choice, and it can be stopped if you're willing to pay the price. But here's the question nobody wanted to ask in 1983, and it's the same question nobody wants to ask now. Why did it happen in the first place? Why did the government, the Federal Reserve, the smart people in the room, let inflation run wild for a decade? Why did they choose to print money they didn't have, to fund wars and programs they couldn't afford? Why did they cut the dollar free from gold and hope nobody would notice? The answer is simple. Because they could. Because in the short term, printing money feels good. It creates jobs. It funds projects. It makes people happy. And the consequences, the inflation, the devaluation, the slow theft of purchasing power, those show up later, years later, long after the politicians who made the decision are out of office, long after the central bankers have retired. The people who benefit from the printing are not the same people who pay for it. It's a delayed explosion, a time bomb with a long fuse, and by the time it goes off, the people who lit it are nowhere to be found. So what does this mean for you? Right now, today, in 2024 or 2025, or whenever you're hearing this, it means the game hasn't changed. The tools are the same. The incentives are the same. The temptation to print money, to deficit spend, to promise more than the system can deliver, that temptation is baked into the structure of modern government. Since the 70s, since Nixon closed the gold window, there is no external limit on how much money can be created. No anchor, no ceiling. Just the wisdom and restraint of the people in charge. And if history has taught us anything, it's that wisdom and restraint are rare commodities, especially in a crisis. Look around. Every major economy on Earth ran the printing presses at full speed during the pandemic. Trillions of dollars, euros, yen, pounds, created out of nothing and pumped into the system. Stimulus checks, business loans, asset purchases. The money supply exploded. And now, surprise, prices are rising. Grocery bills are up. Rent is up. Gas is up. Everything is up. And once again, the people in charge are telling you it's temporary, transitory, supply chain issues, Putin's fault, corporate greed, anything but the one thing it actually is. Too much money, chasing too few goods. You can't print prosperity. You can only print inflation. The lesson from the 70s is clear. When the government tells you everything is fine, check your wallet. When they say the economy is recovering, check your grocery bill. When they promise this time is different, remember Richard standing in that gas line in 1973. Remember Paul Volcker raising rates to 20% and accepting the hate because it was necessary. Remember that inflation is not an accident. It's a choice. And the people making that choice are not the ones who suffer the consequences. So what do? How do you protect yourself in a world where your money is designed to lose value, where the system punishes savers and rewards risk, where the only constant is the slow, grinding devaluation of everything you've worked for? You stop playing their game. You stop accepting the premise that holding cash is safe. It's not. Cash is a melting ice cube. You stop trusting that your paycheck will keep up with prices. It won't. You stop believing that the government will protect your purchasing power. They won't, because protecting your purchasing power would require them to stop printing money, and they're not going to do that. Not willingly. Not until the pain becomes unbearable. Not until the next Volcker shows up and decides to break the machine to save it. Instead, you become ungovernable in the only way that matters. Financially, you buy things that inflation can't touch: land, commodities, skills, assets that produce income. You learn to live below your means, not because you're cheap, but because every dollar you don't spend is a dollar you can convert into something real, something that holds value when the paper burns. You stop measuring your wealth in currency and start measuring it in time. How many months can you survive without income? How many years can you sustain your lifestyle without relying on a system that's rigged against you? This isn't about becoming a prepper or a paranoid survivalist. It's about understanding the game, the rules, the way the board is tilted. In the 1970s, the people who survived inflation were the ones who saw it coming and adjusted. They bought real estate with cheap, borrowed money and paid it back with inflated dollars. They invested in hard assets. They didn't wait for permission. They didn't wait for the government to fix things. They acted. And when the dust settled, they were still standing while their neighbors were buried. The people who got destroyed were the ones who did what they were told. Save your money. Keep it in the bank. Trust the system. Work hard, and you'll be rewarded. Those people watched their savings evaporate. They watched their retirements disappear. They played by the rules, and the rules changed halfway through the game. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Inflation is a wealth transfer, from savers to debtors, from the poor to the rich, from the people who hold cash to the people who hold assets. It's not random. It's not fair. It's structural. And it's been happening for 50 years, since the gold window closed, since the government decided it could print without consequence. The consequence is you, your eroded paycheck, your stagnant savings account, your parents who can't retire, your kids who can't afford a house. That's the consequence, and it's not going away. But you don't have to be a victim. You can learn the language of money, the real language, not the sanitized version they teach in schools. The dark, cynical, ruthlessly honest version that says money is a tool of control and the people who control it will always use it to their advantage. You can study the 1970s and extract the lessons. You can look at Weimar Germany and Zimbabwe and Venezuela and see the endgame. You can accept that the system is not designed to make you wealthy. It's designed to keep you working, keep you consuming, keep you just comfortable enough that you don't ask too many questions. And once you accept that, once you stop expecting the system to save you, you become dangerous. Not violently, not criminally, economically dangerous. Because you're no longer dependent, you're no longer controllable. You've built a life that can withstand the slow collapse of the currency. And when the next crisis hits, when inflation roars back, or the dollar cracks, or the whole thing finally breaks under its own weight, you'll be ready. Not because you're smarter than everyone else, but because you remembered what happened the last time, and you refused to let it happen to you again. The 1970s didn't end because the government suddenly got competent. They ended because someone finally had the guts to inflict short-term pain for long-term stability. And we're waiting for that person again. We're waiting for the next Volcker, the next leader willing to tell the truth, willing to raise rates, willing to let the bad investments fail and the zombie companies die and the over-leveraged speculators lose everything, willing to reset the system even if it means a recession, even if it means people lose their jobs, even if it means the headlines scream and the markets tank and everyone calls them a monster. Until that person shows up, the game continues. The money printer hums, the debt grows, the inflation simmers, and you have a choice. You can pretend it's not happening. You can hope someone else fixes it. Or you can take control of the only thing you actually control: your own decisions, your own resources, your own future. Richard, standing in that gas line, didn't have that choice. He didn't see it coming. He didn't understand the forces at work. He just knew something was wrong. And by the time he figured it out, it was too late. His savings were gone. His purchasing power was shattered. His trust in the system was broken. But you're not, Richard. You have the benefit of hindsight. You have the story. You have the warning. And warnings are only useful if you listen to them. So listen. Inflation is not a bug in the system. It's a feature. It's how governments pay for things they can't afford. It's how central banks paper over mistakes. It's how wealth is quietly redistributed from the many to the few. And it's happening again, right now. While you read this, while you work, while you sleep, the value of your money is dying. Slowly, quietly, with mathematical precision, just like it did in the 70s, just like it always does. The only question is whether you're going to let it take you down with it. Word count, 3,847 words.